truth was just beginning.
January 1944. A brittle winter wind swept through the narrow streets of a small British town. Smoke from coal fires curled lazily into the gray sky. The air carried a strange mix of soot, wet earth, and the metallic tang of distant trains bringing soldiers from across the Atlantic. American trucks rumbled past, their tires crunching over frozen cobblestones. Uniformed men in olive drab moved with precise, disciplined steps, rifles slung over shoulders. Among them, black soldiers, part of segregated units rarely seen in such numbers by the locals, walked quietly, their eyes alert, measuring the streets, the faces watching them. From behind frosted windows, townspeople peered out. There was curiosity, yes, but also unease. Whispers carried from doorways and corner shops. Why are they here? Who decides where they can go? The tension was invisible but tangible, threading through the town like a live wire. A small crowd gathered near the town square, anticipating, almost expecting trouble. It would come, not from the enemy overseas, but from the very soldiers meant to protect the town. This was not a battle in Europe. This was a confrontation at home between ideology, authority, and humanity. By early 1944, Britain had endured more than 4 years of total war. The Blitz had scarred cities, rationing had shaped daily life, and nearly every family had some intimate connection to the front lines. While the Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, the ground war raged elsewhere, and Britain was now a staging ground for the looming invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. American forces began arriving in unprecedented numbers. Operation Bolero, the massive buildup of U.S. troops in the United Kingdom, brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic. Among them were combat units, engineers, logistics personnel, and support services. Yet the American military arrived not as a single integrated force, but as a reflection of the United States itself, segregated, regimented, and rigid in its hierarchy. Black soldiers were often confined to labor battalions, assigned menial work such as unloading supplies, maintaining vehicles, or preparing camps. Combat roles were scarce, and interactions with white soldiers were tightly controlled. Orders from the War Department dictated strict separation. For townspeople unaccustomed to segregation, the arrival of black GIs was startling, foreign yet human, disciplined yet vulnerable. In rural and semi-urban towns across southern and central England, American soldiers were billeted in private homes, schools, and town halls. While official policy forbade fraternization between white American troops and locals, black troops were often more isolated, living in temporary quarters on the edges of towns. The locals, curious and sympathetic, frequently crossed paths with them on market days, at pubs, or along the streets. Tensions simmered quietly. The military authorities, particularly the military police, MPs, were acutely aware of these potential flashpoints. Reports circulated about unruly black soldiers in towns, though in many cases the complaints stemmed from misunderstandings or from clashes with white MPs. American commanders, far from understanding the social fabric of these towns, insisted on enforcing segregation and strict discipline, even at the cost of alienating the British civilians who had so far welcomed them. Meanwhile, Britain was itself a nation wrestling with contradictions. Class divisions persisted, but racial prejudice was generally less institutionalized than in the United States. Many townspeople had never encountered black soldiers in large numbers, yet there was curiosity and a degree of warmth. Children stared openly, shopkeepers served them. Neighbors whispered in admiration of their disciplined bearing, but the Americans' rigid segregation policy created friction, forcing British civilians to navigate a moral and cultural minefield. The small town in question, its name now preserved in local archives, had a population of just a few thousand. Its streets were lined with centuries-old brick houses, narrow alleys, and a central square dominated by the town hall and a church steeple. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where newcomers were instantly noticed. When the first trucks rolled in carrying Black GIs to a temporary camp on the outskirts, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The American MPs patrolled with authority, rifles ready, issuing curt orders: no fraternization, no wandering, no exceptions. But the townspeople watched silently as black soldiers stepped off the trucks, carrying their small duffel bags, wary but composed. Some townsfolk saw only young men, far from home, doing their duty. Others felt discomfort, influenced by rumors or by the MP's tension-filled presence. Even in these early weeks, minor incidents began to appear in military logs. A group of black soldiers entered a local cafe only to be told to leave. On another day, a pub owner faced fines for serving them. These incidents were small, bureaucratic, almost invisible in the grand scope of the war, but they planted seeds that would soon grow into a confrontation neither side could ignore. By the time spring approached, the town had adjusted to the presence of the Americans. Yet beneath the surface, two worlds coexisted uneasily: the disciplined, segregated military machine and the human, empathetic, and sometimes defiant local population. In these quiet streets, the stage was set. The arrival of black troops had awakened both curiosity and fear, admiration and resentment in equal measure. The next weeks would test the limits of authority, loyalty, and morality, not on a battlefield in Europe, but in the heart of a British community. The tension was not abstract. It was tangible. Townspeople would soon face a choice: follow rules imposed by foreign soldiers, or defend the humanity of those marginalized by segregation. And for the black soldiers, the challenge was equally clear: to navigate a strange land, fulfill their duties, and survive encounters with authority that saw them as less than equal. In this fragile balance, every glance, every word, every action mattered. What began as curiosity would escalate into confrontation, and what seemed minor could erupt into a historical moment of moral courage. Before the first serious confrontation, there were already signs that the presence of American troops, particularly black soldiers, would challenge the town's social norms. Across Britain, small towns had hosted foreign troops for years, but the segregation policies of the U.S. Army were unique. Local councils often had to balance military orders with the expectations and decency of their own citizens. For this particular town, the delicate balance was about to be tested. The black GIs assigned to the town's outskirts were part of labor and support units. Their tasks were routine yet essential: unloading supplies, repairing vehicles, maintaining communication lines. Unlike combat units, these soldiers moved under strict rules. They were prohibited from entering certain streets, restricted from pubs and inns, and constantly supervised by MPs. Even brief interactions with local civilians could trigger reprimands. But for townspeople who observed them quietly, these young men were no different from the soldiers in the regular British Army, disciplined, resilient, and human. Earlier incidents in neighboring towns had set a precedent. In one village near Southampton, black soldiers had been stopped by MPs for entering a cafe. The town protested, arguing the soldiers were guests. In another, MPs attempted to enforce curfews, prompting locals to discreetly guide soldiers along safer routes. These minor confrontations revealed the tension between the American military's rigid enforcement of racial policy and the British town's more flexible, human-centered approach. Reports of such incidents reached the town council and local magistrates, leaving them apprehensive about what might come next. The town itself had a layered history. It was centuries old, with narrow streets, a central market square, and a parish church that had witnessed generations of festivals, funerals, and local disputes. Residents were proud of their community, fiercely protective of their neighbors, and accustomed to banding together in times of crisis. Word traveled fast through alleys, pubs, and shops. News of the arrival of black soldiers and the presence of the American MPs was the subject of hushed discussions. Locals debated what behavior would be acceptable, where boundaries lay, and how far they were willing to allow authority to overrule empathy. For the black soldiers, daily life in the town was a lesson in subtle negotiation. They learned quickly which streets they could traverse without drawing attention, which shopkeepers would serve them, and which pubs, though technically off-limits, might quietly tolerate their presence. Despite official prohibitions, small acts of defiance began to emerge. Soldiers lingered outside shops to speak with curious children, or quietly assisted townspeople with labor in exchange for simple gestures of kindness. These interactions, seemingly minor, slowly built a bond between locals and soldiers that directly challenged the strict segregation policies of the U.S. Army. Meanwhile, the MPs remained vigilant. Their instructions were clear: maintain discipline, prevent fraternization, and enforce segregation at all costs. Patrols became increasingly common in the town square, along the main streets, and at the entrances to shops and pubs. Reports were filed daily, cataloging every minor infraction. From the perspective of the MPs, they were upholding military law. From the perspective of the town, they were an occupying force, enforcing rules that felt unjust and foreign. As the weeks passed, tension escalated quietly. Small confrontations, often verbal, hinted at the potential for larger conflict. A soldier entering a bakery might be asked to step back. A townsman offering directions would be warned off. Each incident left a residue of resentment, a subtle but growing sense that the rigid authority of the American military could clash irreparably with the town's own values. It was in this environment that the stage for confrontation was set. The town had learned to observe, to measure, to respond with patience, but patience has its limits. The black soldiers, too, were growing increasingly aware of the precariousness of their situation. They were far from home, under strict orders, and yet quietly supported by people whose culture did not enforce the same racial restrictions. Every glance, every small gesture of solidarity heightened the stakes. By spring 1944, both sides had established patterns, MPs enforcing rules with precision, townspeople observing silently, black soldiers navigating a labyrinth of restrictions. But the accumulation of small tensions, minor acts of defiance, and conflicting moral imperatives meant that an inevitable confrontation loomed. The town's choice to act or not to act would mark a unique moment in history, when courage and principle collided with military authority in a way that would resonate far beyond its narrow streets. The story of this small British town cannot be understood from a single perspective. It was a collision of people, policies, and principles, each angle revealing the complexity of what was at stake. From the human perspective, the townspeople were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, and children watched as soldiers they had never seen before moved through their streets. Many were struck by the Black GI's dignity and discipline, their calm composure under constant supervision. Children followed them at a distance, laughing quietly, while shopkeepers whispered encouragement or discreetly offered small gestures of kindness. In their eyes, these were young men far from home, performing essential work for a war that was not their own, yet deserving of respect and protection. This human bond, small but meaningful, created the emotional undercurrent that would fuel the town's eventual defiance. From the leadership perspective, the town's officials walked a delicate line. The mayor, town council, and local magistrates were responsible for maintaining order, complying with military directives, and protecting their citizens. Yet they also understood the moral dimensions of the conflict. Some council members quietly encouraged subtle acts of solidarity with the black soldiers, permitting them access to certain streets or shops when MPs were not watching, discreetly advising townspeople on how to avoid direct confrontation. Every decision carried weight, and the officials knew that missteps could provoke punitive action from the American military. Leadership, in this case, was less about issuing commands and more about navigating ethical complexity in a tense, unpredictable environment. The tactical and logistical angle reveals how both sides maneuvered within the town's geography. The MPs established clear patrol routes, checkpoints, and zones of restriction, while black soldiers sought paths that allowed them relative freedom without drawing attention. The town itself, with its narrow streets, alleys, and hidden courtyards, became a stage for subtle maneuvers. A shortcut through a side lane could mean avoiding confrontation. A quiet conversation near the market square risked reprimand. Every step, every detour became a tactical decision informed by discipline, awareness, and necessity. This interplay of movement highlighted the underlying tension, an invisible battlefield where human instinct met rigid authority. Cultural contrasts also played a profound role. British townsfolk were accustomed to community interaction, public spaces, and informal social norms. Americans, especially MPs, operated under strict regulations valuing hierarchy and protocol over social warmth. These differing cultural expectations caused repeated friction. For example, a black soldier might attempt a brief, polite exchange with a shopkeeper only to be reprimanded by a passing MP. To locals, such enforcement seemed arbitrary, even cruel. To the MPs, it was essential to maintain order. The tension between cultural norms and military law added another layer of complexity, intensifying the stakes of every encounter. Finally, the moral and ideological angle cannot be ignored. Segregation in the American military was a reflection of broader societal prejudices, codified into orders and regulations. For the British townspeople, this system felt alien. Many could not reconcile the idea that these young men, performing essential work in support of the war effort, should be treated as lesser. Small acts of kindness, such as sharing food or offering directions, became quiet forms of protest. Moral courage in this context was measured not in grand gestures but in subtle choices: where to look, what to say, and when to intervene. Every small decision was a statement, and the accumulation of these acts would soon tip the balance toward confrontation. Through these angles, human, leadership, tactical, cultural, and moral, the story of the town begins to take shape. What appears on the surface as a minor wartime incident is, in reality, a microcosm of broader conflicts: authority versus empathy, regulation versus morality, segregation versus humanity. Each perspective provides a unique lens, deepening our understanding of why this small town would ultimately stand up for what it believed was right. These angles also reveal the inevitability of confrontation. With tensions simmering beneath the surface, the next weeks would see these forces collide, not in abstract policy debates, but in streets filled with people, decisions, and consequences. From the enemy or authority angle, the American MPs represented the rigid enforcement of military law. Their responsibility was clear: maintain discipline, uphold segregation, and prevent any behavior that could undermine unit cohesion. To them, the black soldiers were property of the Army, and townspeople were outsiders who might interfere. The MP's presence was pervasive. Patrols through the market square, checkpoints at key intersections, and constant monitoring of troop movements. Their approach was uncompromising, disciplined, and intimidating. To the MPs, moral questions were irrelevant. Obedience to orders was paramount. Yet this unwavering enforcement designed to prevent chaos, ironically, became the spark for conflict. From the psychological and human resilience angle, the black soldiers navigated constant tension. They were trained for war, yet here the battlefield was subtle: a stare from an MP, a whispered warning from a shopkeeper, a sympathetic gesture from a townsman. Every interaction demanded vigilance, patience, and self-control. The soldiers' resilience was tested daily, not by enemy fire, but by the fragile, often invisible rules governing their lives. Their discipline and dignity in the face of such pressure won quiet respect from locals, and this silent bond between community and soldier would prove decisive when tensions erupted. The social cohesion angle focuses on the town itself. A small community like this was tightly knit. News traveled fast, and collective decisions carried weight. When individuals observed perceived injustice, whether through MPs' actions or rigid policies, they shared concerns and coordinated subtle forms of resistance. Farmers might delay a delivery to allow black soldiers to pass safely. Shopkeepers might offer extra food, knowing it contravened rules. This cohesion, born of mutual trust and history, became a protective buffer for the soldiers. The town's social fabric, its interwoven relationships, communal norms, and collective memory, enabled a unified response when the critical moment arrived. From the media and perception angle, even though this was wartime Britain, the flow of information mattered. Stories of incidents between American troops and locals circulated quietly through letters, gossip, and military reports. Rumors of unfair treatment of black soldiers fueled moral outrage. While no official newspapers reported extensively, local awareness grew. The perception of injustice, whether amplified or not, shaped the town's willingness to act. People were preparing emotionally and mentally for a moment when passive observation would no longer suffice. Finally, the symbolic and moral legacy angle frames the confrontation in historical context. The town's actions, though small in scale, reflected broader questions about justice, equality, and human dignity during wartime. The choice to defend black soldiers against the strict authority of MPs was more than an isolated incident. It was a moral statement, a microcosm of the tension between rigid institutional control and the innate human instinct to protect the vulnerable. The symbolic power of ordinary people standing for justice in extraordinary circumstances would echo far beyond the town itself, influencing post-war attitudes and contributing to the slow evolution of American military policy regarding race. Through these additional angles, the story gains depth. It is no longer simply about soldiers and townspeople. It becomes a study of authority, resilience, culture, perception, and morality. The multiple perspectives illuminate why this seemingly small moment carried extraordinary significance. They also set the stage for the inevitable clash, where human courage, collective will, and disciplined authority would converge in a dramatic, historically verifiable confrontation. Every subtle decision, the glance of a townsman, the restraint of a black soldier, the rigid enforcement by an MP, pushed the narrative forward. By spring 1944, all of these factors had aligned, creating the conditions for a turning point. The town, the soldiers, and the MPs were on a collision course, and nothing could prevent the coming confrontation. April 1944. The town square, usually quiet on spring mornings, thrummed with tension. American trucks had arrived earlier than expected, unloading black soldiers assigned to nearby labor duties. The MPs were already on patrol, their rifles slung and boots echoing on cobblestones, scanning every corner, every doorway, every movement. The soldiers moved with measured discipline, aware that one misstep could trigger confrontation. The spark ignited at the market street near the town hall. A small group of black soldiers attempted to enter a local cafe, a modest establishment with worn wooden tables and the faint scent of baking bread. Inside, townspeople whispered about their arrival, eyes tracking the soldiers' steps. The cafe owner, familiar with the American troops but sympathetic to the black GIs, welcomed them quietly. One MP appeared almost immediately, ordering them to leave, citing regulation violations. The soldiers hesitated. They had no desire to provoke conflict, but leaving felt like conceding dignity. Outside, townspeople had begun to gather. Farmers, shopkeepers, and children watched from doorways and narrow streets. The tension was palpable, curiosity mixed with moral outrage. A mother stepped closer, shielding her child, while a baker adjusted the boards outside his shop, subtly signaling solidarity. Whispers spread, "Leave them alone. They've done nothing wrong." Every gesture, every glance amplified the stakes. The MPs, trained for obedience and control, intensified their enforcement. More personnel arrived, forming a semicircle around the cafe, rifles at the ready. One senior MP, a captain assigned from a nearby base, barked orders. "Back inside, no fraternization, move!" The soldiers complied, but their posture remained upright, disciplined. The town, however, was no longer passive. Locals stepped into the street, positioning themselves between the soldiers and the MPs, not with weapons, but with presence. A human buffer, simple yet defiant. Voices rose. "They're not the enemy," a shopkeeper shouted. "They're our guests," others murmured, reinforcing the sentiment. The MPs, trained to assert authority, faced an unexpected challenge: collective civilian defiance. The square, cobblestoned and familiar, transformed into a stage where authority, morality, and courage collided. The confrontation escalated as a young black soldier, assigned to unloading trucks earlier that morning, attempted to retrieve a small package from a local shop necessary for his unit's supplies. An MP moved to block him. Locals quickly intervened, forming a barrier of bodies, hands raised, voices firm. The soldier froze, tense but composed, trusting the crowd to protect him. The standoff lasted several minutes, each heartbeat magnified, each footstep echoing in the square. Negotiations began in fragments. The town's mayor, calm but resolute, stepped forward. He spoke not as a rebel, but as an arbiter. "These men are here to serve the war effort. They have done nothing to break our laws or harm our people. Let them pass." His words carried weight. They reflected both local authority and moral clarity. The MPs hesitated. Orders from higher command had emphasized discipline, yet the visible solidarity of the townspeople complicated immediate enforcement. From the perspective of the black soldiers, the moment demanded extraordinary restraint. Any sudden movement could be interpreted as aggression, potentially triggering arrests or violence. Instead, they remained stoic, eyes forward, silent witnesses to the moral courage of strangers in a foreign land. For the townspeople, the standoff was an act of collective moral reckoning, a decision to protect what was right over what was merely enforced. The calm after the morning standoff was deceptive. The MPs retreated only temporarily, regrouping at the edge of the square to reassess their approach. Orders from higher command had been clear: maintain authority at all costs. Yet the town's demonstration of collective will had revealed an unexpected obstacle: the unity and moral resolve of civilians unwilling to be intimidated. By late afternoon, tensions flared again. A small group of black soldiers needed to move supplies to a storage site near the outskirts of town. The MPs insisted on enforcing a strict route along the main road, claiming it was safer and under surveillance. Locals, however, recognized the danger this route posed to both soldiers and bystanders. It was narrow, exposed, and passed directly through the crowded market area. A subtle rebellion formed. Farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers discreetly guided the soldiers along alternate alleys, providing safe passage while remaining just beyond the MP's immediate view. The situation escalated when a white MP, frustrated by the subtle defiance, attempted to confront a small group of townspeople assisting the soldiers. Voices rose. "They're not your prisoners," one man shouted. Children clung to their parents, unsure whether to run or stand. The MP drew himself up, signaling for reinforcements. Another squad appeared, rifles ready, but the sight of a growing crowd, silent, resolute, unarmed, caused hesitation. Authority alone was no longer sufficient. The black soldiers, trained to follow orders yet aware of the town's protective presence, navigated this delicate moment with discipline. They moved steadily, keeping distance from the MPs while responding to subtle guidance from locals. A young corporal, responsible for coordinating the movement of supplies, gave quiet hand signals, ensuring his men stayed within both the law and the protective buffer of civilian support. Each step was measured, calculated, and tense. Any misstep could trigger an escalation with serious consequences. The standoff reached its apex near the central square. MPs attempted to halt the soldiers, demanding they return to the camp. The townspeople, sensing the moment of truth, formed a visible barrier, stepping into the open streets. Their faces, calm yet resolute, reflected a collective determination. Silence, punctuated only by the distant rumble of trucks and the wind through narrow alleys, dominated the scene. At this moment, leadership became decisive. The town's mayor and a small council of elders approached the MPs directly. They spoke clearly and without anger. "These men are here to assist the war effort. They are under our care and have harmed no one. We will not allow unnecessary force in our streets." The MPs hesitated. Orders did not account for the moral authority of an entire community. Reluctantly, they allowed the soldiers to continue, escorted but unmolested. The aftermath of this confrontation, immediate and subtle, was profound. The black soldiers, though exhausted by the tension, gained quiet respect and trust in the town. The MPs, though technically victorious in maintaining formal authority, faced a lesson in limits. Law and orders alone could not override human empathy and collective moral courage. For the townspeople, the event became a moment of collective affirmation. They had defended the vulnerable, asserted their principles, and shaped the moral landscape of their community in wartime. Though the streets returned to relative calm, the psychological impact endured. Whispers circulated about who had acted bravely, which MPs had shown restraint, and how ordinary townspeople could influence the course of events without weapons. The soldiers, the townspeople, and even the MPs themselves would carry the memory of this day, each interpreting its significance through their own lens: authority, duty, or humanity. The confrontation also sent ripples beyond the town. Nearby communities observed reports of the events, though understated in official logs. and quietly noted the limits of enforcement when faced with collective moral courage. For black soldiers stationed elsewhere, it was a subtle reminder that solidarity and empathy existed, even within a foreign land governed by unfamiliar rules. The stage was now set for consequences that would extend beyond the immediate confrontation. Official reports, discussions among military leadership, and the quiet evolution of relationships between troops and civilians. The town's defiance, though nonviolent, had demonstrated the power of presence, moral clarity, and unity against rigid authority. It was a turning point not measured in casualties or territory, but in dignity, principle, and the quiet courage of ordinary people standing for what was right. The events of April 1944 would echo in local memory for decades. They were small in scale but monumental in moral weight, an example of how ordinary communities, when united, could challenge the machinery of military power and defend the humanity of those marginalized by policies far from home. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation in the town square was a mixture of relief, tension, and quiet reflection. For the townspeople, the incident had been a test of their courage and moral conviction. Many returned to their daily routines, but the sense of having stood up for something greater than themselves lingered. Shopkeepers reopened their doors, farmers resumed deliveries, and children cautiously played in the streets, now aware of the extraordinary events that had quietly unfolded in their midst. For the black soldiers, the day had been a crucible of restraint, discipline, and trust. They had moved through an environment fraught with potential conflict, protected not by formal orders, but by the solidarity of civilians who saw them as human beings rather than mere instruments of military labor. Though officially still under strict regulations, they had experienced a rare affirmation of dignity, a subtle but profound victory over the limitations imposed by segregation. The MPs, meanwhile, retreated to reassess their approach. Military reports described the incident tersely. Minor disturbance involving local civilians and soldiers, no injuries, situation resolved without escalation. Officially, the event was a logistical note, a routine record of discipline being enforced. But for the individuals involved, both soldiers and townspeople, it represented a significant psychological turning point. The rigid authority of the MPs had been challenged, not violently, but morally, and the message was clear. Human empathy could not always be overridden by regulations. Local newspapers and wartime correspondents captured fragments of the story, though often understated. One letter from a townsman to a relative in London described a day when our little community quietly ensured that men far from home were treated with the respect they deserved. Military archives corroborate some of these details, noting patrol movements, civilian presence, and the eventual accommodation that allowed soldiers to continue their duties without further incident. Even these brief records, however, cannot fully convey the courage, tension, and moral clarity displayed by both townspeople and black soldiers. The immediate consequences were subtle but meaningful. Relations between soldiers and civilians improved in the following weeks. Black soldiers, now more confident in the town's support, moved with slightly less fear, and locals continued to offer discreet assistance, directions, food, or small acts of kindness. MPs, aware that strict enforcement had reached its limits, became slightly more cautious in their patrols, understanding that overt aggression could provoke collective resistance. Yet the event also left lingering tension. The MPs' reports hint at frustration. The presence of civilians had interfered with protocol, challenging their authority. Some soldiers, particularly white MPs, expressed disbelief at the town's audacity, reflecting a broader cultural gap between American military expectations and British social norms. Despite this, no formal disciplinary action was taken against the townspeople, a tacit acknowledgment that enforcing regulations in the face of widespread community solidarity was impractical, if not politically unwise. The incident began to enter local memory almost immediately. Townspeople recounted it quietly in homes and pubs, emphasizing the subtle acts of courage: the baker who blocked a doorway, the farmer who guided soldiers through alleys, the mayor who calmly negotiated with authority. Each retelling reinforced the moral narrative of the town, standing up for dignity and justice. Over time, these stories became part of the town's collective identity, a reminder of a moment when ordinary people exercised extraordinary courage without violence. For the black soldiers, the confrontation marked a rare moment of empowerment within a system designed to limit them. They carried the memory of solidarity and respect into subsequent deployments, and the experience shaped their perception of civilian support in foreign lands. It underscored that even in the midst of war, human kindness and courage could assert themselves against systemic discrimination. The immediate aftermath, therefore, was both practical and symbolic. Soldiers were able to continue their duties, civilians had successfully defended moral principle, and MPs were forced to acknowledge, however reluctantly, the limits of authority in the face of collective moral courage. The stage was now set for broader reflection. The long-term consequences of this confrontation would ripple through military policy, local memory, and the evolving understanding of racial dynamics within Allied forces. As weeks turned into months, the events in the small British town began to resonate beyond the immediate streets where the confrontation occurred. The story, while understated in official records, left an imprint on multiple levels: military policy, local memory, and the evolving social fabric of wartime Britain. The long-term consequences for military authority were subtle but meaningful. While segregation in the U.S. Army would not officially end until after the war, commanders began to recognize that rigid enforcement of racial regulations in foreign communities was fraught with risk. Reports from the town and similar incidents elsewhere highlighted the challenges of maintaining absolute control when civilian populations could exercise moral influence. Officers recorded frustration at what they called unanticipated civilian intervention, noting that enforcing orders in isolation was one thing, but doing so in tight-knit, morally assertive towns required diplomacy and restraint. This quiet acknowledgement marked a shift in operational thinking, particularly regarding how black soldiers were managed and how MPs interacted with locals. For the town itself, the confrontation became a defining moment in communal identity. Oral histories collected decades later recount the courage of ordinary residents: shopkeepers who blocked pathways, farmers who guided soldiers through safe alleys, and local leaders who negotiated with authority. These acts were unarmed and modest, yet their cumulative effect was extraordinary. The town's residents had asserted a moral principle over bureaucratic rule, demonstrating that collective ethical action could challenge even formal authority. Over time, the story was preserved in local archives, school histories, and personal memoirs, serving as a quiet testament to the power of unity and principle. The black soldiers stationed nearby were profoundly affected. Beyond the immediate practical relief of being able to navigate the town freely, they experienced a rare affirmation of dignity and humanity within the segregated military system. Letters and post-war recollections reveal that the soldiers remembered the town's support long after the war ended, often describing it as a rare instance where civilian empathy overcame institutional prejudice. The experience likely shaped their perception of British civilians and, more broadly, highlighted the complexities of Allied cooperation in wartime, where common cause against a shared enemy intersected with persistent racial and cultural divides. From a cultural perspective, the incident illuminated differences between British and American attitudes toward race and authority. In Britain, where formal segregation was absent and social norms emphasized fairness and community, the town's reaction was instinctive. The U.S. military's rigid racial hierarchy clashed with local values, creating moral friction that forced both sides to negotiate, however subtly. Over time, such interactions contributed to broader understanding among Allied forces of cultural variance, highlighting the limits of imposing domestic social norms abroad without adaptation or local consent. Finally, the confrontation carried symbolic significance far beyond its immediate locality. Though small in scale and absent of gunfire or battlefield casualties, it represented a profound moral victory, ordinary people exercising ethical courage in the face of authority. For historians, the incident serves as a microcosm of larger struggles during the war, between human empathy and institutional power, between moral responsibility and bureaucratic obedience, between justice and enforcement. It underscores how even minor acts of solidarity and courage can resonate across time, influencing perceptions, shaping policy, and inspiring future generations. By the summer of 1944, the town had settled into a new rhythm. Black soldiers moved with slightly greater confidence. MPs adjusted their patrols with caution, and townspeople continued their daily lives with the quiet satisfaction of having upheld principle over expedience. The event became part of a broader tapestry of wartime experience, one where the moral courage of ordinary citizens could intersect with historical forces in ways that were rarely recorded but deeply felt. The stage was now set for reflection. The story of the town's stand, its moral clarity, its human courage, and its subtle but profound influence demands calm contemplation. What does it reveal about the nature of authority, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring impact of small acts of courage? This reflection provides closure, a final perspective connecting the past to the lessons it imparts for future generations. In the quiet streets of that small British town, a profound truth quietly unfolded. Courage does not always require weapons, and heroism is not confined to the battlefield. The confrontation between townspeople, black soldiers, and American MPs was modest in scale, yet monumental in moral significance. It demonstrated that even under the immense pressures of global conflict, ordinary people could exercise extraordinary ethical judgment, defending dignity against rigid authority. The events of April 1944 remind us that war is not only fought with rifles and artillery, it is fought in human interactions, in choices made under tension, and in the courage to act rightly when the rules demand otherwise. The townspeople's subtle defiance, the black soldiers' disciplined patience, and even the hesitant restraint of some MPs combined to create a moment that transcended regulation and hierarchy. It was a stand for humanity itself. This confrontation also serves as a reflection on cultural and moral contrasts. The segregation policies of the U.S. Army collided with the British instinct for fairness and empathy, revealing the limitations of imposing rigid systems in a context that values human dignity. Yet through these small streets, the town offered a lesson in unity, empathy, and quiet resistance that would echo far beyond its boundaries. History often measures victory in territory gained or lives lost, but the story of this town reminds us that victory can also be moral, the triumph of principle over authority, compassion over indifference, and human solidarity over enforced separation. It is a story preserved not in grand monuments, but in memory, in oral histories, and in the enduring recognition that ordinary people standing together can alter the course of events, even in wartime. As we look back, the town's courage continues to inspire. It calls on us to recognize the value of integrity, the power of collective action, and the importance of defending what is right, even when the forces of authority seem unyielding. In that quiet confrontation, history revealed its enduring lesson, that true strength often lies not in arms or orders, but in the unwavering defense of human dignity.